The desert doesn't just kill you with thirst, it grinds you down to dust, first one agonizing step at a time. For Nova Virelle, each sunrise in the Arizona territory was a promise of pain, her life measured in the weight of water hauled across miles of unforgiving rock and sand. The world had branded her as worthless a woman clinging to the edge of existence. But what happens when the only hand that reaches out from the shimmering heat belongs to the man the world calls a ghost, a savage? This isn't a story of capture. It's the story of a woman who had to be taken by an Apache warrior to finally find her freedom, her strength, and a love more fierce than the sun itself. The sun was a merciless god in the Arizona territory of 1878. It rained from a bleached white sky, beating down on the cracked earth until the very air shimmered with malice. For Nova Virelle, this god demanded a daily tithe, and that tithe was her strength. Her world had shrunk to the two wooden buckets slung over her shoulders, connected by a groaning yoke that had sculpted permanent angry grooves into her flesh. Each morning, before the sun had fully asserted its tyranny, she began her pilgrimage. Not to a church, but to the trickle of life that was the communal well on the far side of redemption's end. The town was named with an irony so bitter it coated the back of Nova's throat like dust. There was no redemption here, only judgment. Nova was a ghost in this town of ghosts. Her husband Thomas, a prospector with eyes full of pyrite dreams and lungs full of rock dust, had coughed himself into an early grave 2 years prior. He had left her with nothing but a barren patch of land a mile out of town, a shack that shuddered in the wind, and a name that the townsfolk spoke with a mixture of pity and contempt. She was the widow Virelle, the poor woman, a living reminder of failed ambition. The walk to the well was the easy part. The buckets were hollow, echoing her own emptiness. It was the return journey that was a descent into a special kind of hell. Filled to the brim, the buckets weighed nearly 80 pounds. The water sloshed, mocking her with its life-giving coolness as sweat stung her eyes and pasted stray strands of auburn hair to her temples. Her boots, worn to paper-thin soles, offered no protection from the sharp stones that littered the path. Each step was a carefully calculated negotiation with gravity and exhaustion. This morning, the weight felt heavier. A tension coiled in the air of redemption's end, tighter than a rattlesnake ready to strike. As she approached the well, she saw the source of it, Silas Blackwood. Silas owned the largest ranch in the county, a sprawling empire built on cattle cunning and the quiet intimidation of lesser men. He stood by the well, his tall frame clad in a tailored black coat that seemed to absorb the light around him. Beside him, looking profoundly uncomfortable, was Sheriff Brody Miller, a man whose authority was perpetually undermined by Blackwood's wealth. Morning Nova, Silas drawled his voice, a low rumble. He had a handsome face, but his smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Come for your daily charity." Nova flinched, but kept her expression neutral. She set her buckets down her shoulders, screaming in protest. "It's a communal well, Silas. My husband helped dig it." "Your husband is dead," Silas stated, not with sympathy, but with the finality of a judge's gavel. "And the water table is running low. My cattle need it. The town needs it. We can't afford to be wasting it on a lost cause." A few women, gathered with their own buckets, looked away. They knew the truth. The well wasn't running low. Silas was simply tightening his grip. He had been circling Nova for months, like a vulture. He'd made his offers crude proposals of marriage that were more like terms of surrender. He didn't want a wife. He wanted to own the last piece of land that bordered his southern range, and the woman who came with it was a minor inconvenience, a trophy of his conquest. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat. Now Silas, the lady's entitled to her share. Is she? Silas turned his gaze on the sheriff, and Miller seemed to shrink. She contributes nothing. Her land is fallow. She's a drain. From now on, water from this well is for paying members of this community. Or he turned back to Nova, his eyes sweeping over her worn dress for my future bride. The humiliation was a physical blow. It struck her harder than the sun, to be bartered for to have her survival held hostage in front of the entire town. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel their stares, a mixture of pity from the women and smug satisfaction from the men who orbited Silas. "I am not for sale," she said, her voice low but shaking with a fury she rarely allowed herself to feel. Silas chuckled. "Everything is for sale out here, Nova. You just haven't realized your price yet." He gestured to the well. "Take what you need for today. It's the last free sip you'll get." Her pride screamed at her to leave the buckets, to walk away, with her head held high, but her body already parched betrayed her. The garden she painstakingly nurtured with this water, her only source of food beyond what she could afford from the tight-fisted mercy of the general store, would wither and die by noon. Her life was in those buckets. With burning cheeks, she worked the winch, the rope, groaning in protest. She filled her buckets, the silence of the crowd, a deafening roar in her ears. She refused to look at Silas as she settled the yoke back onto her shoulders. The weight was immense, not just of water, but of shame. As she began her agonizing walk back, his voice followed her, a parting shot. "There's another spring, you know, about 5 miles east, out in Apache territory. I'm sure they'd be happy to share." The men laughed. It was a joke as cruel as the desert itself. The very word Apache was a curse, a name whispered to frightened children and grown men alike. They were spoken of as phantoms raiders who emerged from the heat haze to kill and vanish without a trace. To go there was to court a gruesome death. The walk home was a blur of pain and fury. When she finally reached her shack, she let the buckets thud to the ground, collapsing against the rough-hewn wood of her home, her body trembling with exhaustion and rage. She looked at her reflection in the sloshing water, a gaunt face, eyes too large and haunted, framed by hair the color of rust and sorrow. She was trapped. Silas had closed his fist around her life, and he would only squeeze tighter. Marry him and die a slow death of the soul, or refuse and die a fast one of thirst. For 2 days she rationed the water from that last trip, her tongue thick and her head pounding. Her small patch of squash and beans began to wilt, the leaves curling in on themselves as if in prayer. On the 3rd morning, she woke to a profound and terrifying silence. The usual morning chorus of birds was gone. The air was still and heavy. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm or a death. She looked at her empty buckets. Then she looked east, towards the distant jagged line of the Dragoon Mountains, Apache territory. Silas's words came back to her, no longer a joke, but a sliver of an idea, a desperate, insane, suicidal idea. What if he was wrong? What if the stories were just that, stories told by men like him, to keep people afraid, to keep them penned in? What if death by an Apache arrow was quicker, more merciful than the slow, humiliating submissions Silas was demanding? A reckless resolve born of utter desperation took root in her heart. She would not be Silas Blackwood's property. She would not wither away in this shack. If she was going to die, She would die walking toward a chance, however slim, rather than kneeling before a certainty. She took a small sack, placing in it a piece of hardtack and the knife Thomas had left her. She picked up the empty buckets and the yoke. It was a foolish gesture. She couldn't possibly carry 80 pounds of water for 5 miles, but leaving them behind felt like admitting defeat before she even began. With one last look at the shack that had been her prison, Nova Virelle turned her back on redemption's end and walked east into the heart of the land the world had told her to fear more than death itself. The sun was rising, casting her long, lonely shadow before her, a dark finger pointing the way into the unknown. The landscape changed a mile east of her property. The familiar downtrodden path gave way to a world untamed. The ground was a mosaic of jagged rock and deep orange sand dotted with skeletal Ocotillo spiny cholla and the stoic green giants of the saguaro cactus, their arms raised as if in a perpetual state of surrender to the sky. The silence here was different from the oppressive quiet of the town. It was alive. A hawk circled high overhead, its cry a lonely, piercing note. The dry rustle of a lizard in the brush, the low hum of unseen insects, it was the language of a world that existed without pity or judgment, governed only by the primal laws of survival. For the first time in a long time, Nova felt that she was not being watched. The yoke and buckets were an absurdity now. After an hour, she abandoned them, hiding them behind a cluster of boulders. They were symbols of her old life, a life she was walking away from one step at a time. She kept only the sack with her knife and the hardtack. She didn't have the moisture in her mouth to eat. By midday, the sun was at its zenith, a white-hot anvil in the sky. The heat was a physical presence, pressing down, stealing the breath from her lungs and the moisture from her skin. Her head throbbed with a dull, persistent rhythm. The mountains, which had seemed so close this morning, remained a distant, shimmering promise. She had no canteen, a folly, born of a mind cracked by desperation. Her thirst was a living thing, a clawing beast in her throat. The world began to tilt. The edges of her vision blurred, darkening into a tunnel. The ground seemed to rush up to meet her, and she fell not with a cry, but with a silent, weary acceptance. The hot sand burned against her cheek. This was it then. Not a warrior's arrow, not a rattlesnake's bite, but a quiet, ignominious end. Her last coherent thought was of water, a cool, clear image that was the cruelest of mirages. She drifted in a feverish haze, unsure if she was experiencing seconds or hours. She was vaguely aware of a shadow falling over her. A buzzard, she thought, with a detached sense of irony. Come to claim me. But this shadow had a presence. It was solid. A hand, surprisingly gentle, touched her forehead. It was cool. She managed to pry her eyes open the light, a searing pain. A figure knelt over her, silhouetted against the blinding sun. It was a man. His skin was the color of rich copper earth. High cheekbones framed a strong aquiline nose and a firm mouth that held no hint of a smile or a sneer. His hair was long black and bound by a simple leather band. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, deep-set, and intelligent. They assessed her, not with the feral savagery of the stories, but with a calm, unnerving intensity. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple open vest that revealed a chest and arms corded with lean muscle. He was an Apache. Fear, primal and cold, lanced through her delirium. She tried to scramble away, a pathetic, crab-like motion in the sand. Her hand fumbled for the knife in her sack. The man made no move to stop her. He simply watched, his expression unchanging. Then he spoke. His voice was low, guttural, the words completely alien to her. He held up an empty hand, palm open, a universal sign of peace. Nova froze her fingers, inches from the knife. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was waiting. Slowly, he reached for a gourd, tied to his hip. He uncorked it, and moving with a deliberate lack of threat, extended it to her. Water. The sight of it, the faint cool scent of it, broke through her terror. The beast in her throat roared. She looked from the gourd to his eyes. There was no trickery there, only a solemn stillness. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took it. The water was the most glorious thing she had ever tasted. It was cool and clean, with a faint, earthy sweetness. She drank greedily, then stopped, coughing, her body unused to such a blessing. He said something else, another soft, low command, and gestured for her to drink more slowly. She obeyed, taking small, measured sips, until the clawing in her throat subsided. He watched her, his gaze missing nothing. He saw the raw, chafed skin on her shoulders from the yoke, the thinness of her wrists, the terror giving way to a desperate animal gratitude in her eyes. When she was done, she held the gourd out to him. He took it, corked it, and tied it back to his hip. He then rose in a single, fluid motion. He was taller than she had realized, a man made of sinew and desert wisdom. He looked back in the direction she had come, then at her. He pointed to himself. "Two shadows," he said. The name was spoken as if it were a piece of the landscape itself. Then he pointed at her. "Nova, she whispered, her voice a raw croak. He tilted his head, listening to the sound of it. He didn't try to repeat it. He then gestured to the east, towards the mountains. He made a walking motion with his fingers, then pointed to her, and then to himself. The meaning was clear. "You come with me." The fear returned. This was the moment of truth. The gentle rescue was over. The capture was beginning. But what was the alternative? To stay here and let the sun finish the job? He had given her water. He hadn't harmed her. The men who laughed at the thought of her coming here were more savage than this silent man had been. She gave a slow, hesitant nod. Getting to her feet was an ordeal. Her legs were shaky, and the world still swam before her eyes. Two shadows watched impassive, letting her find her own strength. When she stumbled, he reached out a hand, not to grab her, but to steady her elbow. His touch was firm, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her. The walk was slow. He set a pace she could manage, moving with an effortless ground-covering stride that she struggled to match. He didn't speak again, but communicated with simple, eloquent gestures, pointing out a loose rock, indicating a patch of smoother sand. He moved through this harsh, dangerous world as if it were his home, reading its secrets in the turn of a leaf or the track of a snake. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, they arrived. Tucked into a shallow, hidden canyon, sheltered by massive red rock formations, was a small settlement. It was not the fearsome war camp of her nightmares. It was a place of life. Wickiup's domed dwellings, made of brush and hide, were scattered amongst the boulders. The air smelled of roasting meat and wood smoke. Children played, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls, and women worked together, tanning hides and grinding corn. Their arrival caused a stir. People stopped what they were doing, their dark eyes turning to her. There was no open hostility, but a deep, penetrating curiosity. They looked at her tattered dress, her sunburnt face, her obvious weakness. They were looking at a creature from another world. An older woman, with a face like a beautiful wrinkled map, and eyes as bright as a hawk's approached them. She spoke to two shadows, her voice a series of rapid questioning clicks and tones. He answered her calmly, his voice never rising, occasionally gesturing back in the direction they had come. During the exchange, Nova felt a small hand slip into hers. She looked down to see a young boy, no more than 5 years old, with two shadows' solemn eyes. He stared up at her, not with fear, but with a wide, innocent curiosity. Two shadows looked down, and the slightest softening touched his lips. He placed a hand on the boy's head. The message was clear. This was his son. The old woman, who he called Ishkene, led Nova to an empty wickiup. Inside, it was clean and surprisingly cool. A soft hide was laid out for her to rest on. The woman gave her a bowl of savory stew and another gourd of water. As Nova ate, the boy, whose name was Taza, sat just outside the entrance, watching her with his unblinking gaze. In the days that followed, Nova lived in a strange limbo. She was not a prisoner. No one guarded her. She was free to walk around the small encampment, though she knew she wouldn't survive a day if she tried to leave. She was an object of intense scrutiny. The people of this Rancheria Two Shadows band watched her every move. They were the Chiricahua, a name she had heard spoken with dread, but here she saw only families. She saw a community bound by ties she couldn't comprehend, speaking a language that was as musical as it was mysterious. She learned through observation. She saw their reverence for water, how not a single drop was wasted. She saw their incredible resilience, their ability to pull a vibrant life from a land that the white man could only see as barren. She saw that Two Shadows was their leader, not by force, but by respect. His word was law, because it was always wise, and he, in turn, watched her. He would appear at her wickiup in the evening bringing her food. He never tried to touch her, never made any demands. He would simply sit sometimes with his son, watching her with those intense, unreadable eyes. One evening, he brought a piece of buckskin scraped clean and soft. He laid out a piece of charcoal and with a few deft strokes drew a picture of a yoke with 2 buckets. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. Tears welled in Nova's eyes. She nodded, then used the charcoal to draw a crude picture of a well and a tall, stick-figure man with a menacing air. Silas. She drew a line through the well. Two Shadows studied her drawing for a long time. His expression hardened almost imperceptibly. He understood. He understood the language of oppression of power used to crush the weak. A week after her arrival, he came to her wickiup as the last light faded. Taza was asleep in his arms. He spoke, and this time he used a few words of broken Spanish, the trade language of the territory. Hombre malo, he said, pointing to her drawing of Silas. Bad man. He then pointed to her. Mujer fuerte. Strong woman. He paused, choosing his words carefully. He looked around the canyon at the safety of his home, at his sleeping child. Aquí agua, aquí comida, no. He searched for the word, then made the motion of a yoke on his shoulders. No yoke. He then said a word in his own tongue, his voice soft but resonant. Ma ishtane. He looked at her, waiting. Ishkaine. The old woman had been teaching Nova a few words. She had pointed to the resilient agave plant, the one that survives the worst droughts, and called it by a similar name. Nova understood the implication. The one who endures. He was offering her a choice. Not marriage in the way she understood it, not a contract of ownership signed in a dusty church. It was an offer of sanctuary. a place in his world, a place by his side. It was a proposal spoken in the unspoken language of shared survival. To be his wife was to become part of this life, to be a mother to his son, to be protected by his strength and respected for her own. To the world she had left behind, she was being made a savage's bride. But sitting there, in the cool quiet of the canyon, looking at the man who had saved her and the child who needed a mother, Nova felt a stirring of something she had thought long dead hope. She looked at two shadows, the Apache warrior, the man they called a ghost. She thought of Silas Blackwood and the living death he offered. The choice was not between two men. It was between two ways of dying and one improbable way of living. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and pushed the drawing of Silas into the embers of the fire. She watched it curl, blacken, and turn to ash. Then she looked back at two shadows and gave a single, firm nod. Back in Redemption's End, Nova Virelle's disappearance was a spark dropped into a tinderbox of fear and prejudice. For 3 days, her vacant shack was a silent accusation. On the 4th day, Silas Blackwood made his move. He rode into town like a storm front, his face a mask of righteous fury. He reined his horse to a dramatic halt in front of the saloon, the dust settling around him like a shroud. "She's gone," he boomed his voice, carrying across the dusty street. "Nova Virelle, taken the Apache, have her." The word shot through the town like a volley of rifle fire. Men poured out of the saloon and the general store. Sheriff Miller emerged from his office, his hand resting warily on the butt of his pistol. "Now hold on," Silas Miller said, his voice a frail barrier against the rising tide of panic. "You don't know that for a fact, don't I?" Silas dismounted, his movements sharp and angry. He was a master actor, playing his part to perfection. "I warned her. We all know where she went east, towards the dragoons, that devil they call Apache. He has her. Stolen a white woman from right under our noses." He wasn't talking about a specific man. To Silas and to most in the town, Apache was a monolithic entity, a singular savage beast. But by invoking the name, he was stoking the deepest fears of every man present. He was painting a picture of violation of their way of life, being threatened by a faceless enemy. She was a good woman, if a bit lost. Mrs. Gable. The store owner sniffled from her doorway, already rewriting history. To befall such a fate? "We can't let this stand," shouted a ranch hand, his face flushed with whiskey and outrage. "We ride. We get her back." The cry was taken up by others. A mob mentality, ugly and potent, was taking hold. Sheriff Miller held up his hands. "This is madness. Riding into their territory blind is suicide. We need to send a rider to Fort Huachuca. Get the army." "The army." Silas spat on the ground. "By the time those bluebellies get here, there won't be anything left of her to save. I say we handle this ourselves. As men, are we going to let these savages dictate who lives and dies in our county?" He swept his gaze over the crowd, his eyes landing on men who owed him money, men who worked for him, men who feared him. "I'm forming a posse. For Nova. Who rides with me?" It was a foregone conclusion. To refuse was to be branded a coward, an Apache sympathizer. One by one, hands went up. Sheriff Miller, seeing his authority evaporate, knew he had no choice. If he didn't go with them, he couldn't control them. With a heavy sigh and a curse under his breath, he nodded. "All right, but I'm leading it. And we do this by the book." Silas smiled, a thin, triumphant slash. "Of course, Sheriff. By the book." He knew that once they were out in the desert, his book was the only one that would matter. His motivations were a venomous brew. He was consumed by a proprietary rage. Nova was his to break, his to own. That she had defied him, choosing the unknown over his offer, was an insult he could not bear. But beneath the anger was a cold, sharp fear. Nova wasn't just a spurned woman, she was a loose end. His profitable illegal side business involved selling repeating rifles and ammunition to a particularly violent band of Chiricahua, led by a brutal warrior named Chokanan, a rival faction to Two Shadows' more peaceful clan. The guns were funneled through a hidden cache in a dry canyon not far from Nova's land. If she had stumbled upon it, or if Two Shadows' people found it, he would be ruined, if not hanged. He had to get her back, or silence her permanently. The posse was the perfect cover. In Two Shadows Canyon, Nova was discovering a new rhythm to life. The Chiricahua word for wife, Ishtiane, meant more than a partner. It meant the keeper of the home's heart. She learned from Ishkay how to grind mesquite beans into flour, how to identify edible roots, and how to stitch deer hide with an agave thorn and sinew. It was hard work, but it was purposeful. It was work that sustained life, rather than work that merely postponed death. Her relationship with Two Shadows was one of quiet, growing intimacy. It was built in the spaces between words. A shared look across the fire, the way he would gently correct her pronunciation of an Apache word, the trust he showed by leaving Taza in her care. The boy, once timid, now followed her everywhere, a small, solemn shadow. He was teaching her his language, and she was teaching him the English nursery rhymes she remembered from her own brief childhood. For the first time since Thomas died, Nova felt the fragile stirrings of a home. One afternoon, a scout rode into the camp, his horse lathered and his face grim. He spoke in low, urgent tones to Two Shadows, gesturing to the west. Nova caught one word, Inda, the white eyes. Two Shadows' face became a granite mask. He came to her. Men, he said, in his sparse Spanish. They come, many men, with rifles. A cold dread washed over Nova. Silas, Two Shadows nodded. He understood this was the consequence of her drawing in the fire. He issued a series of quiet commands. The camp transformed. Women and children melted into hidden caves higher up the canyon walls. The warriors, perhaps a dozen of them, checked their weapons. They were not preparing for a battle, but for a defense. Nova's heart hammered against her ribs. This was her fault. She had brought the violence of her world into this sanctuary. I will talk to them, she said, her voice shaking. They are here for me. I can tell them I am here by choice. Two Shadows looked at her then, at the mouth of the canyon. The man, Silas. His heart is bad. Words will not fill the holes in it. But he didn't forbid her. He respected her courage. He simply said, "We will be with you in the shadows." The posse arrived an hour later. They rode into the canyon's entrance with a misplaced bravado that quickly died as they took in the towering rock walls. It was a perfect trap. "Hello," the camp Sheriff Miller yelled, his voice sounding small and thin. Silas pushed his horse forward. "We know you have her, you heathen bastards. Send out the woman, and we might let you live." From the center of the camp, Nova stepped out into the open. The men in the posse stared slack-jawed. She was not the bedraggled, broken creature they expected. She wore a simple buckskin dress, her hair was neatly braided, and she stood with a straight-backed dignity they had never seen in her before. She looked healthy, strong. "Nova," Sheriff Miller exclaimed relief, warring with confusion on his face. "Are you all right? He didn't harm you." "I am fine, Sheriff," she called out, her voice clear and steady. "I was not harmed. I was saved." Silas's face contorted in a sneer. "Saved? Don't be a fool, woman. You're bewitched. They've filled your head with nonsense. Come with us now. Come home. This is my home." Nova said the words, surprising her with their absolute certainty. "I am here by my own choice. I am the wife of their chief." The statement landed like a bomb. The men muttered their prejudice, confirming what they now saw as the ultimate degradation. She hadn't just been captured. She had surrendered, joined them. "You see," Silas roared, turning to the others. "She's turned against her own kind. She's no better than them now." He raised his rifle. "This is a rescue, whether she wants it or not." "Hold your fire," Silas Miller commanded, but it was too late. The moment was fracturing. "He's the reason I left," Nova shouted, her voice ringing with the force of her conviction. She took a step forward, her eyes locked on Silas. "He tried to starve me out, to force me into a marriage I didn't want." "He's the savage lies," Silas screamed, his composure finally cracking. "Is it a lie that you keep a cache of Winchester rifles in the canyon north of my old property?" Nova's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Is it a lie that you sell them to Chockenan's band, the same band that burned the Miller homestead last spring?" A collective gasp went through the posse. Even Sheriff Miller, whose own cousin had been killed in that raid, looked at Silas in horror. The pieces clicked into place. Silas's uncanny knowledge of raid timings, his vocal opposition to army intervention, his immense, unexplained wealth. Silas's face went pale. He had underestimated her. He had seen a weak, poor widow, not a woman with a keen memory and the courage to speak the truth. He was exposed, ruined. His eyes darted around, seeing not allies, but accusers. His world was collapsing. In a motion of pure reptilian instinct, he swung his rifle toward Nova. "You lying bitch!" He never fired. An arrow fletched in black sprouted from his throat with a sickening thump. It appeared as if from nowhere, a deadly punctuation mark to his sentence. He gurgled, a look of profound shock on his face, and toppled from his horse into the dust. The shot had come from two shadows who had materialized on a rock ledge above them, his bow still taut. In the same instant, his warriors appeared from the shadows, their rifles leveled, their faces grim. The posse, leaderless and terrified, threw down their guns. The confrontation was over before it had truly begun. Sheriff Miller stared at Silas's body, then up at two shadows, and finally at Nova. The entire ugly truth of the situation settled on him with a crushing weight. He had been a pawn in a dead man's greedy game. He slowly dismounted, his hands raised. He looked at Nova, not with accusation, but with a weary, dawning respect. "He saved you," Miller said, his voice raspy. It wasn't a question. Nova looked from the dead man in the dust to the living one on the ledge. One had offered her a cage of tarnished gold, the other a life of hardship and honor. "Yes," she said, her voice finally steady. "He did." The echo of the unseen gunshot faded, replaced by the profound silence of the canyon, a silence where truth had finally spoken louder than lies. The aftermath was a tableau of surreal stillness. The remaining members of the posse stood huddled together, disarmed and shaken, their bravado evaporated and replaced by a primal fear of the silent warriors who held them captive. Silas Blackwood's body lay in the afternoon sun, a stark testament to his own treachery. Sheriff Miller, his face aged a decade in a matter of minutes, walked slowly towards Nova. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The disciplined Apache warriors, the women and children, now emerging cautiously from their hiding places, and Nova standing at the center of it all. The rifles, he said, his voice heavy. "You're certain I saw the crates myself," Sheriff Nova replied. "Months ago, I was foraging for roots and stumbled into the canyon. They were covered with a tarp. I didn't understand what they were then, but when you mentioned the Miller raid, the timing, it all made sense." She had not in fact seen them, but Two Shadows' scouts had. After her crude drawing, he had sent them to investigate the area around her shack, a precaution that had unearthed Silas's entire operation. But in that moment, claiming the discovery as her own was a necessary act, a way to bridge the chasm of disbelief. Miller nodded, his shoulders slumping. He looked up at Two Shadows, who had descended from the ledge and now stood beside Nova. His presence was not menacing, but it was absolute. Tazar ran to his father's side, clinging to his leg and peering at the white men with wide, wary eyes. "Your law, Two Shadows," said to the sheriff, his Spanish clear and direct, "killed this man. Not my arrow. His lies killed him." The sheriff didn't argue. He knew it was the truth. Silas had been executed by his own web of deceit. "What happens now?" Miller asked, looking from Two Shadows to the terrified men of the posse. "They are your people," Two Shadows said, with a gesture of dismissal. "They are guilty of foolishness, not evil. Their hearts were poisoned by his words. Take them. Take the dead one, and tell your town the truth. Tell them who armed Chokonen. Tell them the raids were funded by a man they respected. It was an act of extraordinary clemency. He could have slaughtered them all, and no one in the white world would have been the wiser. Instead, he was offering a chance at a different future, a future based on a painful truth rather than a comfortable lie. Nova watched as the posse, humbled and silent, collected their weapons under the watchful eyes of the Apache. They tied Silas's body over his own horse for the ignominious journey home. Before he mounted, Sheriff Miller paused and looked directly at Nova. "He offered you a place," the sheriff stated, a note of wonder in his voice. "He offered me a home," Nova corrected gently. "He offered me respect. Your town offered me charity and shame. Where would you have me stand?" Sheriff Miller had no answer. He simply tipped his hat, a gesture of respect he had never once offered her in Redemption's End, mounted his horse, and led the procession of defeated men out of the canyon. As the sound of their horses faded, a profound quiet settled. The dust began to settle, both literally and figuratively. The tension that had held the camp in its grip for days finally broke. Ishkaine came to Nova and placed a comforting hand on her arm, murmuring words of approval. Taza, seeing the threat was gone, finally released his father's leg and took Nova's hand. That night, the mood in the rancheria was somber but also relieved. A great danger had been met and averted. Nova sat with Two Shadows and Taza by their fire. The chasm between them had been bridged by the day's events. She was no longer just a refugee he had taken in. She was the woman who had stood for them, who had spoken a truth that protected them. And he was the man who had killed to protect her. Their bond, forged in the crucible of conflict, had hardened into something unbreakable. "My son," Two Shadows said, looking at Taza, who was leaning sleepily against Nova's side. "His mother was taken by the coughing sickness like your man." It was the most he had ever shared about his past. The shared grief was another thread binding them together. "He is a good boy," Nova said softly, stroking Taza's black hair. "He is strong like his father." Two Shadows looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something beyond solemnity and strength in his eyes. It was a deep, quiet warmth, an emotion that needed no words. He reached out and gently touched the place on her shoulder that had once been raw from the yoke. The skin was smooth, now healed. He was acknowledging her past pain and her present strength all at once. In that moment, she was truly his wife. The ceremony had not been one of words or rings, but of shared danger, mutual protection, and the silent understanding that their lives were now intertwined. A few days later, Nova knew she had one last thing to do. With 2 warriors as an escort, a gesture of protection, not possession, she rode back towards her old life. The shack looked even smaller and more pathetic than she remembered. It was a hollow shell, a monument to a life of quiet desperation. She walked inside, the air thick with the ghosts of her loneliness. She didn't take much. A small locket with a miniature of her mother, a worn book of poetry, and her sewing kit. As she was about to leave, she saw the yoke and buckets which the warriors had retrieved for her. She looked at the wooden instrument of her torture, then at the strong, capable hands she now possessed. With a resolve she didn't know she had, she took the yoke and placed it in the cold hearth. Then she took the buckets and smashed them against the stone floor until the wood splintered. It was a ritual of destruction, a final violent rejection of the life that had almost broken her. She walked out into the sun, leaving the door open, an invitation for the wind and sand to reclaim the space. She would not be looking back. As she rode away, she saw a lone rider approaching from Redemption's End. It was Sheriff Miller. He reined in his horse, keeping a respectful distance from her escort. "The town knows," he said, his voice weary. "We found the cache of rifles, exactly where you said. The council is in an uproar. Blackwood's empire is already being carved up by his creditors." He paused. "Things are changing." "Good," was all Nova said. "You're not coming back," he stated. "No." He nodded slowly, accepting it. "Can I tell them you're happy?" Nova thought of Tarza's small hand in hers, of the quiet dignity of her new life, of the profound, unspoken warmth in Two Shadows' eyes. "You can tell them I'm free," she replied. With a final nod, Sheriff Miller turned his horse and rode back toward the town of so-called Redemption. Nova turned hers east toward the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, toward the settling dust and the promise of a new dawn. 2 years passed. The seasons wheeled across the Arizona territory, each leaving its mark on the land and its people. The fierce sun of summer gave way to the sharp, cool winds of winter, followed by the miraculous fleeting bloom of the spring. For Nova, these were not just changes in weather, but the rhythms of a life she had fully embraced. She was no longer Nova Virelle the widow. She was now known as Ishka ne Nova, a name of respect that linked her to the wise old woman who had become her second mother. Her skin, once pale and sickly, was now burnished by the sun to a healthy bronze. Her hands, once soft and then blistered, were now strong and capable, skilled in tasks she had never imagined. She could track a deer, find water in the shade of a rock, and speak the musical language of the Chiricahua with a fluency that made Tarza laugh with delight. Her life with Two Shadows had settled into a partnership of deep, abiding affection. Their love was not one of effusive poetry or grand declarations, but of shared burdens and quiet understanding. It was in the way he would bring her the first bloom of the prickly pear cactus, the way she would have a hot meal waiting when he returned from a hunt, the way they would sit together in the evenings, watching the stars blaze to life in the vast ink-black sky, Tarza sleeping soundly between them. She was no longer just a mother to his son, She was a mother to their son. The events of that fateful day in the canyon had sent shockwaves through the region. Sheriff Miller, true to his word, had exposed Silas Blackwood's treachery. The revelation that one of their own had been arming the renegade Apaches for profit shattered the simple black-and-white worldview of redemption's end. They were forced to confront a difficult truth: the monster they feared was not always the one with the unfamiliar face. A fragile, unspoken truce had formed between the town and Two Shadows' band. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was a cessation of hostilities born from a shared enemy and a newfound grudging respect. Occasionally, Sheriff Miller would ride out, not with a posse, but with a pack mule carrying salt flour and coffee for trade. He and Two Shadows would talk, two leaders from different worlds, finding common ground in their desire for peace for their people. Chokanen's renegade band, their supply of high-powered rifles cut off, had been diminished, eventually driven out of the territory by a combination of pressure from the U.S. Army and Two Shadows' own warriors, who would no longer tolerate a rogue element that threatened the delicate balance. One warm afternoon, Nova was with Taza not far from the main camp. They were in a small, verdant alcove, where a natural spring bubbled up from the earth, creating a stream that flowed clear and cool over smooth grey stones. This was their water source. It was a place of life and laughter. Taza, now a sturdy boy of 7, was trying to catch darting water skimmers with his hands, his face a mask of intense concentration. Nova sat on a sun-warmed boulder, mending one of Two Shadows' shirts. She watched her son, a smile playing on her lips. The memory of her old life of the yoke and the endless agonizing walk for water felt like a story that had happened to someone else. It was a faint, pale scar on a soul that had otherwise healed completely. She remembered the crushing weight on her shoulders, the burning shame, the feeling of being trapped in a life that was slowly grinding her to nothing. She had walked into the desert seeking an end, and instead had found a beginning. She had thought she was being taken, but she had been set free. Two Shadows appeared, walking silently from the trees. He came and sat beside her, his presence as comforting and familiar as the warmth of the rock. He followed her gaze to Taza, who had finally given up on the water skimmers and was now splashing happily in the shallow stream. "He has your laugh," Two Shadows said in English, a language he now used more frequently with her, enjoying the private world it created between them. "He has your spirit," she replied, leaning her head against his strong shoulder. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. He looked at the stream, the source of their life, so easily accessible, so pure. He knew the story of her past, the full weight of what this simple scene represented. "No more Yokma Ishtar ni," he said softly, using his enduring name for her. "The one who endures." Nova squeezed his hand, a wave of profound gratitude washing over her. The desert had not claimed her. The town had not broken her. Silas had not owned her. She had walked through fire and found her home in the heart of the flames. She was a woman who had once hauled water for miles just to survive a desperate soul on the edge of the world. Now she was the respected wife of an Apache chief, a loving mother, a strong and vital part of a people who had taught her the true meaning of wealth. She looked at the laughing child, at the man by her side, at the water flowing freely at her feet, and she knew she was no longer struggling. She was home. The story of Nova Virelle is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest prisons are the ones we accept for ourselves, and true freedom can be found in the places we've been taught to fear. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the universal language of love and respect that transcends culture and prejudice. If this story of survival courage and finding a home in the most unexpected of places moved you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit the like button to let us know you enjoyed it. Share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful drama. And most importantly, subscribe and ring the bell. We have so many more tales from the dusty trails of history to share with you, and we wouldn't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.